Hi, everybody.
Hi.
So I think we have people that are still joining us, but we'll get started. How's everything? Where are you? You're coming at us today, Molly, from DC, right? Or
That's right. I'm in DC where it is hot and sunny.
and same with Victoria,
No, I'm actually calling from California today,
California. So well,
where it's not that hot. It's quite cool today.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, Victoria. And if you are among any of our friends joining us from the Western states, I just wanted to welcome everybody. I'm Lisa Palmer. I'm George Washington University's National Geographic Professor of Science Communication. And so it's my great honor to welcome you here and welcome everybody that's joining us for this webinar. I serve as senior editor and the education lead here at Planet Forward. And we are GW's innovative media platform. So in addition to publishing, we host events such as this, where we can engage a diverse audience of college students and professionals and faculty from across the country. And we use the idea of storytelling and media and educational events to find a way to lift the stories of invention or collaboration and ideas that can move the planet forward. So today we are here welcoming our special guests and communication experts, Molly Bingham and Victoria Fine. Welcome of Orb Media for this event. And so I know that Molly will introduce herself, but she has a long career in journalism before shifting her interest to creating these amazing partnerships with scientists and journalists. And so Molly and Victoria will lead this workshop for students on how sort of journalists and scientists can forge these collaborative partnerships and to both sort of gather and report on some new scientific findings to reveal new information. And so I think I'm really excited to hear more. So I'll leave it to you and hand the baton over, but we'll have some dialogue throughout. So I hope we can get to everybody's questions, and I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Super. Thanks, Lisa. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Give me 1 second. So everybody can see the screen okay and see the deck?
Yes.
Great. So we're Orb Media, and we're going to talk about when journalists and scientists collaborate, how magic can happen. And quickly, Orb catalyzes global change through attention. And we do that by investigating new issues, collaborating with scientists and other media newsrooms, and then illuminating those issues to a really wide audience through those partnerships so that the public better understands the world around them. And it looks like we have about 16 or 17 participants so far. And I know that we have some people from the scientific and the research world and some who are more communications and journalism students. So I want to welcome you all. And I am a journalist, but I have tried to shape our conversation today so that both of you groups will get some things out of it. Victoria Fine, Orb CEO, is with us today. Victoria, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, for sure. I'm Victoria Fine, Orb CEO. I'm thrilled to be here today. I have a huge passion around communicating around sustainability, climate change, and other socially impactful issues. And that's been the basis of my career, gaming and trying different ways to do that in a whole variety of interesting tactics. So I'm really excited to share with you all the summation of all of the work that Molly's done with Orb Media before and during my tenure at Orb. I will be a little bit in the background today. I'll be DJing in your questions and supporting any other back and forth that we might have in our conversation together. And I just wanted to add a little bit of protocol for doing that. Feel free to pop anything in the chat as it comes up. But if you have a specific question that you'd like to ask, we will be pausing throughout the presentation for discussion. And so you can go ahead and pop those questions into the Q&A feature in Zoom. You can also look at everybody else's questions and upvote the ones that you think are interesting for us to address first. We'll also have some time at the end to work through any other questions you may have, as well as if you have any projects in mind that you've been noodling on in terms of scientific research that you've been thinking about of how to reach a wider audience, or If you're a journalist and you have questions that you don't know how to get a scientific answer to, but you're really intrigued by that, we can work through some of those while we have time. So in the meantime, I'll be working my magic on the back end of this presentation, and I'll let Molly take it away.
Cool. Thank you, Victoria, as always. Um, so basically, I founded Orb because what I was discovering and feeling in my experience was that the world was globally increasingly interdependent, and yet our media was increasingly fragmented and nationalized. And I found that dissonance really actually destructive as we face a plethora of opportunities and challenges that no one nation can control. So climate change, pandemics, air quality, conflict, all these things that wrap in lots and lots of countries and people from around the world. So I designed Orb Media to tell stories about things that we have in common across those national, cultural, and linguistic differences. And I am not a scientist, but it was pretty clear quickly to me that to have any integrity in telling stories that are relevant to hundreds of millions or even billions of people, and to see trends and make statements that are global in nature, that relying on sort of the norm of anecdotal reporting or looking at some situation unfolding in one place just really wasn't going to cut it. So we started doing our own original data science and physical science in order to be able to make those global statements. And so Orb has produced 13 investigations. I personally ran 6, including the 2 we'll talk about today, before handing the reins off to an executive editor. And our projects relied on original data science or original physical science, which gave us a new finding that we could share with the world. So working with this really fantastic data scientist, Heather Krause, we started doing original data science on our very first project, No Place Like Home, exploring reported levels of and perceptions about intimate partner violence or domestic violence around the world. And many of our projects have relied on her data science work. But today, what I'm going to focus on are 2 projects that were built on original physical science, where we worked with a scientist to design and execute a study. So let me get into the right box here. There we go. Whoops. Yeah. And I'm just going to change my view here so I can see more people. Great. Okay, so with our 6th investigation, we began collaborating with other newsrooms on reporting and disseminating our work, which meant that what we were learning, we were sharing with a bigger audience and people across languages and cultures and nationalities via brands that those people, the public, already had invested their trust in, already go to for their information, instead of encountering a new media organization. And before founding Orb, I covered conflict, mostly in the Middle East and Central Africa. I was also the official White House photographer to the vice president for a few years. And after more than a year in Iraq, in 2003 and 2004, I became what I'll describe as pretty disenchanted with the industry. I felt newsrooms really weren't being courageous enough in challenging sources that we've invested with power and authority in our society, or leading the public in conversations that needed to unfold around the conflict. And so basically I quit. I'd been taking a lot of risk on what I thought were really important issues, but if the industry wasn't willing to challenge the narratives that was being set, in this case by the Pentagon and the White House, then those risks really weren't worth it in my mind. So I have had the pleasure of both Nieman and Sulzberger fellowships, and frankly have had the most amazing life traveling around the world as a journalist and learning a ton. I really see journalism as an incredible privilege to learn and about the things you think are important. And with that, I think comes also a massive responsibility to share what you find as widely as possible. So with that, we're going to go into our next slide here. So today, what we're going to really talk about is why journalists should work with scientists, why scientists might think about working with journalists and newsrooms, and the magic that can happen when these 2 groups collaborate. And I'll talk you through these case studies of these 2 stories. And then we'll also talk after that about some of the keys to making these newsroom researcher relationships work. So why should journalists consider working with researchers or and doing original physical science? So first of all, mostly, we all have questions. And I think that when you go and Google or, spend more time than that, investigating to see whether there's any kind of research that's been done on that, sometimes it hasn't. And I just want to say, that I think one of the most important things as a journalist is being proactive. I think we often set ourselves up to respond to events and to information that is pushed to us. And so being proactive about the questions that you have in your mind can really catalyze great conversations. And working with scientists can help you answer questions that maybe are important to you and others, but have not yet really been addressed in science that you can identify. And I also think that neither data nor science nor journalism hold truth per se, but that when we fuse data science and journalism, or physical science and journalism together, you get a closer picture of reality. And that's something that you can more readily convey to the public that you serve. Also, when you're working with a scientist, when you're working with science, you can make a more inclusive, kind of wider statement about the world by diversifying examples. Instead of just looking at a situation unfolding in one place, you can look at that similar conditions in other places. So instead of anecdotally sourcing things, you can really report with integrity about things that have been collected, data that's been collected really well. And then, here's sort of the catnip for journalists in the group today, which is that you get to discover, break, and own like an exclusive story that can have global reach and impact depending on how you decide you need to disseminate it. And that's just really a powerful, amazing thing to have a story you have that much investment in and own so well. So for the scientists and researchers in the world, this is, from my experience of doing this, some reasons why you might want to work with newsrooms or individual journalists. Your work and your research really matter, but your process isn't really designed for the general public to hear about your work, or only under very limited circumstances and conditions. And when they do hear about it, what we found and what I've seen happen for others is that more research and more money for that research can unfold to better understand the important issue that you're working on. So I think that lifting the visibility of your research and why it matters to the public is something that's really helpful, right? And can help the research move forward. And as a scientist, you own the design and execution of the actual research. So that shouldn't ever be something that you feel pushed to compromise on. But journalists can really help brainstorm the ways you might shape the question of your research, or how samples are taken, or where they're taken from, in a way that might make the outcomes of the research more readily relevant to the public. And they can, make all kinds of suggestions there and brainstorm with you. But ultimately, again, you should control the reins of the study. And then, you measure, analyze, and share findings, which is sort of your role in this. But journalists take those scientific findings and develop a responsible public statement about them, and then contextualize that information. So putting it back into what humans best learn from, right? Which is a story. And so that's really our job in this, is to work with you to understand what you're doing and turn it back into something that human beings easily relate to. So I'm going to just pause there and ask, does anybody have any questions? Do we have any questions in the Q&A yet that we want to ask? Anything I should clarify? Okay.
I don't see any questions in the Q&A.
Okay, great.
And I don't see any raised hands. So
okay. Awesome. I will move on. All right. So case study. So I'm going to walk you through two related projects that Orb conducted by collaborating with a researcher, a scientist, a chemist in this case, and how that process unfolded. So in 2013, the New York Times ran an article about microplastic beads being found in the Great Lakes in the United States. And I basically keep kind of a running tab in my head, or a spreadsheet actually sometimes, of questions that I have, stories that I have. And this story really catalyzed a big question for me, which was that if these are microbeads that are coming from our toothpaste and other products and are not being filtered out by the septic and sewer systems that treat the water and put it back into, in this case, the Great Lakes, are those filtering systems that we use for our drinking water, which we also take from the same fresh water, are those small enough to filter out the microplastic that's in our freshwater, apparently, right? And so that was the question that occurred to me in 2013, and I kind of made a note of it. So journalists in the House, right? Like, I think that I just want to encourage you again to be proactive. Like, what you see, what you read, like, ideas come from all kinds of places, from your lived experience, from things you hear in your social network, from you know, news reports you see, but you have questions about them. Those are all great. And in this presentation, my goal is to just encourage you to be like, I have a really important question. Like, let me figure out how to go about it. So in 2016, I really started putting this project in motion with Orb, and we did research to look for scientific studies that might have been done testing tap water for microplastics, and we did not find anything. And so instead of letting that stop me, I went back to that New York Times article from 2013 and found the researcher and found her online and called her up and basically introduced myself and asked my question, which is, you know, is there microplastics in the tap water that we drink? And for journalists, you know, the key there is to be proactive, right? And if that researcher says no, you know, ask them for references and figure out who else might be right for this kind of study. And for the researchers in the House, you know, I just want to flag, like, she took my call, right? She returned my email, like, she, you know, she didn't like, oh my God, I'm too busy to talk to somebody, right? She actually engaged with me in a constructive conversation. And so, you know, that was really helpful. And I wouldn't have gotten where we got if she hadn't done that. So what the conversation with her revealed was that, in fact, there was no scientific testing of tap water for microplastics, and that basically the only science that existed were literally like 1 or 2 samples from, you know, a tap in Dublin or something like that. So it was not at all you know, global in nature. And so I asked her, I said, would you be interested in designing and executing a study to test tap water for microplastics? And she was like, hell yes, that's exactly what I like to do. So for scientists and researchers in the House, this research question fit really well into work she was already doing on beer and sea salt, right? Where she was testing them, running a study, testing those for microplastics. And it also furthered her research from the Great Lakes, right? So it gave her a next step in that research that felt important to her. And she had, of course, like the skill sets and the track record. So it felt like a really good fit. And I think that's just really important when either you approach somebody or you get approached, just think about the fit for your own research. And then on the journalists, for that step, like, had those things not been true, as I said, I would have asked her for another, you know, to refer me to somebody in the field, right, that she thinks might be interested or have more information about it. And for both of you, my very next questions for her when she was like, yeah, let's do this, sounds like a great idea. I said, okay, so how would you think about giving us exclusivity in this relationship as a journalism organization? We want to be able to publish this first. And at the time that I started these conversations with her, I did not know that we were going to publish with a cohort of other media organizations, which we ended up doing. But she, we talked it through, and she understood why that was important. And when that exclusivity would end, that basically as soon as we published, everybody would have access to the information. And so that was a really important thing to you know, talk to her up front about, and what that meant, what the expectations were. So we then partnered to design the study, talking through what would make it a really good story, and defining our roles, like clarifying our roles. And Dr. Mason decided to design all the protocols, which was appropriate, and explain to us why they were what they were, and specifically outlined the sample collection protocols that Orb could then share with people around the world to take samples and send them in, right? So that was also a really big part of like, how can we share this information so that we get samples from where we want? And our remit is global as an organization. So following her protocols that she designed, we collected 150 samples from cities and towns on 5 continents and had them shipped to her lab, where they were tested for microplastic fibers that were 100 microns or greater in size, which is like less than a human hair. And what we found was that 83% of those samples contained microplastic fibers, right? Which is a pretty big deal. So to the researchers in the house, like we never tried to tell Dr. Mason how to do her science, but she was open and really communicative about why she was selecting the process. And this is going to be important later. We'll come back to talk about that. And what we did talk her through was the diversity of samples that we wanted, and finding out kind of how big a sample size we needed from each location for that to be a relevant statement scientifically, right? We didn't want to set this up where it was clear, you know, we hadn't done our science very well. And then for journalists, you know, because we wanted the story to have a really global punch, we talked through the variety of sample types we wanted to collect from different geographic locations, of course, but also different types of locations. So like rural locations versus urban, different types of sources. So municipal water, well water, water that's considered untreated versus treated water. And we even threw a bottle of bottled water in to the testing just to sort of have that in the picture. And we tested from people's homes and public taps in Uganda, in really rural Uganda, to you know, like fancy locations, like in the congressional reception area, right, in Washington. So places with name recognition really also helped. And by doing this process, we were set up to have a massive humdinger like of a story, but we
Hey,
didn't know what the
Molly,
result. Yeah,
before
pause me.
you get there, we have a big question that I know one person asked, and a lot of other people are thinking. This is a huge effort. So, how did you get the scientist to fund their research? How did you work with that scientist? And how did you fund your part of the research? And how did you talk through that with the researcher?
Yeah, super good question. So Orb was funded for this project through a Dutch foundation called Adesium, and we had actually pitched them a suite of 10 different stories, and they'd given us 5 and had basically said, like, figure one of these out. We don't care which one. So, you know, we really drove the story selection process. And then for the researcher, she, as I mentioned, she was already conducting a study, and that was funded through her university and the lab that she was working with. And we will come to this towards the end of some of our process, a little more specifically about the ethics around funding and science and that relationship. So that's something we'll talk about. And if I don't answer all your questions there, let's talk about it more, okay? Anything else at the moment? Or are we
Perfect.
good?
Yeah, can you just say what's the name exactly of that foundation? I didn't hear it.
It's the Adesium Foundation.
Oh,
It's a private Dutch family foundation.
Thanks.
And they had a pretty robust journalism funding structure, but I think they have been changing up their priorities. Okay, so let me just see where we were here. So at the time that we started this relationship and the science and got the answers to the research, right, from Dr. Mason, when we started it, we didn't know what the results would be, of course. So while it followed, you know, logic that tap water might or should contain microplastics, counting on that would have been pretty foolhardy as a journalism organization, right? So journalists stood up. This isn't a guaranteed home run. You know, you might have really ambivalent answers in the science, right? And so that's important to think about and plan for. And then second, like at the time, Orb had an audience of like 5 people, and my family is bigger than that. So once the findings were complete and the team had done the reporting, rather than let a pin drop in a really noisy room, I decided that it was important for the world to hear what we had found, and that Orb publishing alone really wasn't a pathway that I felt comfortable with. So rather than hoarding our findings, which is a common journalism behavior, Orb built partnerships with 14 newsrooms around the world to publish at a set time and date. So we worked under what's called embargo. If you don't know what that is, it means you basically share information ahead of time under the agreement that whoever you're sharing it with will not share it further or discuss it publicly until the end of the embargo time. And so that was really important and helped the story really move. So I've talked about exclusives and embargo. Unless there are any other big questions about those, I'm not going to talk any further about that right now. The thing I think to remember about exclusives is that fundamentally, if you're building a cohort of organizations to publish something together, if the information leaks out before your embargo time, like basically like it takes all the air out of the story and nobody will do it, right? So it's just really important to be able to hold those and have everybody in the relationship understand what those mean. And so the outcomes from publishing this kind of project with a partnership, a scientific partnership, and with the publication, the other newsroom partners, right? The outcome was that we really raised awareness. This was The Guardian was our main publication partner. It was a massive hit for them story-wise and traffic-wise. They were really happy. It stayed on their homepage for a really long time. It was the front page of the print newspaper, which for them is also still a big sale point, and really effectively catalyzed a global dialogue about our creation, use, and disposal of plastics. That raised awareness of our individual participation in this problem and hence our power to change it. So, for me, in a kickoff story like that was really exciting, and it worked really, really well. And so I'm going to go into the second story, which we did. So as soon as we had the results from the tap water research, I was like, oh my God, what about bottled water, right? We've all been paying money for bottled water, like what's in there? And so I called Dr. Mason, literally like 2 weeks later. I was like, so everyone on the team is really wondering, like, what about bottled water? And she was like, that's such a good question. We should really do that. And so we set up a second project with her that led right on from that. And so I'm going to walk you through these 6 steps. And while I kind of do that, I'm going to talk about the plus plastic project so that you can kind of understand it in the context of a process.
And Molly, can I pause you for one moment and add a little bit of context to this? So I think one of the reasons why that particular scientist was so excited to work on these projects with you, from my observation of working with you on this, was that number one, it fit directly into the research that she was already doing. So she really didn't have to change much about her research setup, the equipment that she had. She had to test a lot more samples. So there was a bit more on her end in terms of like person power to create output from that. But at the same time, she was able to ask some questions that she wasn't able to ask by herself. And she also got some support in terms of collection and coordination from Orb's team in order to test not just, I think she was testing beer and salt and one other thing at the time, but the testing technique was very similar and she could apply that to water. So she kind of got a bonus for what she was already funded for, which made it very easy to do the first story and then the add-on story from that.
Yeah, that's totally right. And I think this will also come up a little bit later, but she had also a lot of independence and agency in how she ran her lab. Like her lab was set and she could do pretty much what she wanted. And that's not always the case. So this will come up a little bit later when we talk more about building the relationship. So the first step is not to collect samples. The first step is actually to design your study. So before number one there is just, work with your researcher to design the study, get them to explain why they're choosing certain processes. For Plus Plastics, for the second project, actually over the time of the research, the technology and the tools for studying microplastics in water had changed. And so she decided that she wanted to use these new protocols, which meant that we didn't have an apples to apples comparison when we went from tap water to bottled water. And so that was kind of a bummer on our part, but we also understood why that was important for her. And it was right to use, top of the line sort of analysis techniques. And so this process was testing plastic particles that were 100 micron in size instead of fibers. And that was different. So for those of you who do not know this, plastic does not disintegrate. It just breaks into smaller and smaller pieces. So we were looking for those pieces of plastic. And microfibers come from a different source generally. So they're slightly different kind of output. But it raises some important questions for you about whether your study is a one-off project, like whether there might be sequels, if so, how many, like what kind of developments your own project might trigger, and thinking about those kind of at the front if you can, if you have a bigger question in mind, I think is really important and helpful. It will impact the way you collect the samples, how many samples you collect, how you test them, and then how and whether those samples are then stored after the completion of the science. So who would be responsible for that? What are the conditions of storage? All of that becomes then way more important. So the step one here is to collect your samples. For this experiment, we did research on brands that were either like massively globally dominant and or ones that were really primary in big countries like China and Brazil, right, and India. So we did a sort of Venn diagram of those two qualities and came up with 11 bottled brands. And we designed a step-by-step process using well, I mean, so the collection requirements were not the same this time because we weren't taking samples from tap water, but we were assigning fixers fundamentally to purchase cases of bottled water and then ship them. And for some brands, that was important. They're essentially bottled tap water, so they have multiple bottling facilities around the world. So we didn't just want, like Nestle Pure Life, for example, is like this. We didn't just want one case of Nestle Pure Life. We wanted to have 3 or 4 cases bought from different locations around the world so that we had a diversity of their bottling processes. And the purchasers were required to document the purchase and shipping so that we had a chain of custody and evidence of that chain of custody and evidence of them reaching the lab and being recorded there. We bought way
Molly,
more. Yeah.
Can you just explain why chain of custody is important? It's important from a scientific perspective, but it's really important from a journalistic perspective. And I think the scientists on this call might be particularly interested in learning more about that.
Yeah, I mean, we'll also talk a little bit about this later, but definitely when you're about to take an individual or an organization or a corporation and impact their business, I think you want to be able to prove that what was tested is their product, right? Or is their output. And so sort of preparing for contest, basically, at the beginning, we recorded a lot of the process in a way that was could be used as evidence, basically, that this was in fact a bottle from this company that was tested. And we also bought more water than we tested so that Dr. Mason and her researchers could select bottles from a case at random. So it wasn't like we had pre-selected anything, right? She could just choose what she wanted. So we ultimately tested 250 bottles from 11 brands and finding on average that a liter of bottled water had 314.6 pieces of plastic bigger than 100 microns in it, right? So that was also pretty revelatory information. So we documented the scientific research process as well as the collection of the samples. We had done some of this for Invisibles, but given, as I said, that we were challenging some pretty massive corporations in a very big business of selling water, we set up some further documentation and recording of the testing process at the lab, which again, like Dr. Mason was fine with, but it's just to demonstrate like these are the protocols within the lab and how people are working. And then our team also went and filmed the whole process, interviewing the research team while they were doing the testing and prior to knowing the results, which is actually, I think, also really important because you then get their own sense of query and curiosity locked into your story and your reporting, and you also really understand what's happening in the lab. And that, in our case, led to some really good conversations about things were different than our team had anticipated them to be. And so being able to talk those through and resolve those while they were there at the lab was really, really helpful. So once all the testing has been done, the scientists will analyze the raw data. So she had created a spreadsheet with the bottles and then the amounts of plastic that were in the filters. And once they've been tested, she shared a rough draft of the report, of her scientific report, and that spreadsheet with us. And while we had zero interest in impacting the results of the science, what we wanted to do was support Dr. Mason and her team in what was sort of a combination of like proofreading and communications counsel, right? We did also like triple check numbers and percentages just to make sure that like we got the same answers that she got from everything. And this is really, I think, for researchers, actually for both groups here, it's just really important that is a, Dr. Mason had the final say of what language she used and why she used that language, but we just offered it because scientists aren't always ready for the kind of scrutiny that will come to their work if they work with a newsroom. And I think making sure that every sentence was clear about what the implication of that was and making sure that she knew that ahead of time was really why we were doing that with her. So she finalized her scientific report, and then the other thing to think about for newsrooms is where you will post that report when you publish. We're going to talk about peer review a little later because that will come up. But fundamentally, if you are collaborating and have an exclusive and you are where that information will first hit the public, you need to plan where that report will be posted so that the public can have access to it and other researchers because they will want it too. So then the next step, number 4, is really important and really vague. So bear with me while I kind of talk through why this is important. So it's amazing how easy it is to say something wrong about a scientific finding. That is what I've learned in doing science for almost 10 years. So the editor, the reporting team, the researcher, and anyone else who needs to be on the team, right, meets to agree on what's called I call it an editorial statement. Everyone can agree that it's accurate, that it's catchy enough to attract an audience, and that this statement fundamentally, like out of that comes the headline, the lead, and the nut graph, right? Which is really what's at the top of a story, right? I mean, this is what it gets shared. It's what people see on their feeds, right? So that information is really important to both get accurate and also grab attention. And so this is a process because you are in a relationship, a scientific and reporting relationship, and respecting that relationship, I think, is really important. And when we were talking through how we would describe the science, what we discovered is that both our data researcher and our data scientist and Dr. Mason had really strong feelings about their science not being taken out of context. And so I think you want to respect the relationship that you have with the scientist and do this responsibly. And you can still do it responsibly and your story can still have really good legs, right? So this is a really important pause to take, and it can take a little longer. Like it can take a few conversations, sometimes not just one. So it would often take us a week or more to get a full agreement around language on this important subject. So,
and I'd love to just interject there and say, I think one of the hardest parts about this process is to be able to include the nuance that comes with a scientific study into something that's public facing, which is why you have to have those conversations. There's 2 points where nuance comes in. There's the findings from the study itself, and then there's talking about those findings. And so one of the really unique elements of this process that ORB has developed is including that conversation and developing a statement that is inclusive of that nuance and discusses it ahead of time before having the nuance kind of pulled out and taken apart once things are published. And that really makes the relationship between the researcher and the newsroom much stronger from the beginning, but it also allows the information to go a lot farther because it can be repeated and used in other geographies and markets while still maintaining the integrity of the both the science and the, I would say, like the newsworthy finding from the science.
Yeah, that's true. Thanks. So we talked a little bit about peer review a minute ago. Fundamentally, ORB and our partners publish both of these projects without having them peer reviewed first. This is unusual, and most newsrooms have a policy of not publishing material that has not been peer reviewed. In other words, they will only publish on material that's been peer reviewed. They will make exceptions for that when they feel like public interest is really like, you know, so important they need to hear it, which is the sort of clause most of the newsrooms that we work with used. You can also see COVID, like anything you read right now, like they'll say in an unpeer reviewed research released today, right? So that happens, but it's something to talk about if you're building partnerships and think about what your own organization's policy is. And it's really good to clarify with the researcher early on whether they have plans to submit for peer review. Not every researcher does or wants to. So if they are, who are they going to submit that to and when? And if you must wait for a peer-reviewed report and research to do the publication, just really be mindful that that could be maybe 3 months on the early side, and maybe like 18. So figuring out like what that adds to your time and why that might be worth it is important. I will say in the science that we did, the science had completely changed in the period of time between like when we did the science and when we published, and then when her research came out as peer reviewed, right? And so that can change the findings, right? And your story can be out of date pretty quickly. So that's something to think about there. And then the last step here is to what I call customizing the findings for pickup and impact. And Victoria was talking about that a little bit already, which is breaking things down, not just by a global statement for us, but by, either culturally, regionally, nationally, demographically relevant sections, and making that part of the finished report so that when you're sharing it, as she said, it's easy to share, easy for others to pick up. And Dr. Mason included those like breakdowns, those subgroups in her finished report. So they were also there. It wasn't us doing that alone and extrapolating from her research. It was her making those statements. So the outcome from this process the second time around was also really big. The BBC was our anchor partner for this. We also worked with Deutsche Welle. So between the World Service and Deutsche Welle, we hit in like more than 30 languages, and then across television and print and digital and radio. So it was really a huge story, and drove the news cycle for a minute, which is hard to do. And the World Health Organization basically called for a review of the impact of ingesting plastics on humans. That research really hadn't been significantly done, so they wanted to start catalyzing that. And regulatory bodies around the world indicated that they had the intention to more closely monitor bottled water and potentially regulate it for plastics. Individuals, companies, communities, governments took steps to mitigate single-use plastic in particular, and lots of more research was instigated after we had published. And our work is often cited by the scientists doing that research as like, when I saw that, like I knew I had to ask these other questions and where I wanted to look, and this is how it fit into my skills. So, you really can trigger that query in other researchers and get a bulk of research going that can help us understand our world. So I'm going to pause there again briefly and ask if there are any questions right now. I'm just noticing, Lisa, that we're at 44 minutes, so I want to check on time with you.
So I'd love to. I know that Victoria said how do you deal with? You will maybe talk about the case study, the uncertainty component. But can you touch on that now? Like whereas we have this idea of this in science, uncertainty is just part of the research, but there's a real disconnect between science and how the media view uncertainty. And so at what point do you have to use some of your the real estate on your page to talk about uncertainty in that context?
That's a really good question. So we handled that in a few ways. And one is that, so we had exclusivity and an embargo. And so we shaped that upfront language that all of our partners were going to use. And part of what they were agreeing to in the partnership was that they would run with the same lead, right? Like that basically that was not going to change globally. And then the other thing that we did was we published a data version of the story. So we actually had a whole section of our website and this story that explained the process of the science, who had done the science, how it had unfolded, and that's where the report was posted also. So that really helped address, I think, and explain. We got a lot of requests from researchers saying, I don't see the report. And I was like, it's there, like you can find it. So people really did like look at that, even on our website, right? We weren't trying to drive traffic to us. So I think that kind of what we called a data explainer or the science explainer. And then we also did build graphics that were in the story that explained the science itself. Again, with physical science, it is easier to say, this isn't self-reporting, basically. We measured X number of pieces of plastic. Now, measurement itself is not perfect. So, there's always a level of question. When the study was peer reviewed, she ended up changing a small detail, which, was a big deal in some contexts, where, basically the dye, this is way too much for me, but like the dye she used adheres to synthetic fabrics. And somebody's like, but you didn't actually take that thing and like find out if it is actually plastic. It's like, well, but that's all this stain adheres to, right? So what else is in our bottled water that would, be synthetic, right? So, and they look like microparticles anyway. So, there is uncertainty. And I think being, one of my big keys for like making these relationships work is transparency between each other, clarity of roles, like over communication when you're hitting roadblocks or, problems, or something in the science isn't going the way you expected. Like, call, make that conversation happen, be upfront, and transparency, with publishing partners, if you build that way, and the public around how the science was done, why it was done in this way. What are you trying to demonstrate? We weren't trying to show that all bottled water has plastic. We were trying to, catalyze a bigger question about how plastic's showing up in our environment. Does that help understand, Lisa?
Yes.
I'd love to
absolutely.
add to that and then pose a question from our audience. The one additional piece of uncertainty actually might come earlier in the process, which is that you go down a great road with a researcher and then the results of that are inconclusive, or the research that you're doing leads you to a conclusion that's very different from what your hypothesis was. And I would add to that that's not uncommon. That happens a lot of the time when you're doing an investigative report. But in this case, I think one of the things that has made ORB really unique in terms of how it has handled that situation, and we encourage our partners to do the same, is to actually highlight the flaws in the system that led to that inconclusive conclusion, if that's the case. So for example, if we're unable to make a global statement about a set of scientific samples because they're unavailable, or the data is just completely impossible to get from a private source, like the story can be that question is out there and that's not being made public yet. And why isn't it being made public? And to really investigate not just the conclusions from data and scientific work that's happening, but the things that are being left out from that process and why they're being left out. One of the things that we really focus on at ORB is building equity into the system of scientific and data reporting, and really looking not just at developed countries that have like a really developed data infrastructure or scientific infrastructure, but those countries that may not yet have been collecting data in the same way, and how do we get information about them and compare that so that we have a bigger global understanding. So I think uncertainty can be a really good, useful tool for public dialogue, even if you don't end up with the story that you thought you were going to get at the beginning of that experience. I'm going to ask one more question that has come up from the audience, and then I just want to flag for Molly. I know we have a few more slides, so I think we'll have to make some choices about what we share. But the question that just came up from June Yan is, as a statistician data scientist, I'm curious about the role of statisticians in your peer review process. Many medical journals have statistical reviewers to make sure the published papers are correct in the statistical sense. Could you elaborate on your views on the role of statisticians and data in the world of journalism? Molly is going to eat this one up, but you have to do it briefly, Molly, so that we can bring in a few more points.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, so that is a great question. So ORB from the beginning worked with the data scientist named Heather Kraus. She is an amazing data scientist because she is really good with her numbers and her data science stuff. I'm going to do this. And she also has a really good curious brain, and she's a good communicator about it. And so she actually worked with us on every project as a consultant, and then she came on staff, even for these physical science projects. So frankly, I think the crux of your answer seems to be like, even in this physical science space, Dr. Mason did her math about the statements that she was able to do, but Heather actually did double and triple checking of that. And And for our other projects, which were data science based, we had, you know, confidence intervals and lots of more nuanced language around how the data science was done, why it was done that way, even some of the structures and algorithms that she used to run and why they were done that way. So we tried to, if you are curious, go on our website, and each story has a data section that will explain to you not only like what was the source of the data that we used, did we create a new data set by merging other sets, did we collect new data, and explain how those were done, why they were done, how it impacted what we were able to say, and how we built, frankly, that editorial statement from the research rather than the other way around. So I hope that answered your question. And Lisa, I'm happy to kind of pitch the rest of the deck. I think we have, you know, the big picture out there, and I can try to hit some of the bigger themes.
Yeah, like even if you want to pull in some of the bigger themes and pull up some of the slides, if there's anything that touches on this, you know, my sort of a couple of burning questions that I have, and please, with the audience that's here, you know, feel free to pull in your ideas or pop them into the chat or the Q&A. You know, some of the burning questions I have is, okay, you've got, I mean, I'm all about spreadsheets, as many of my coworkers know. Like I have my ideas and projects listed there. So how do you go from that idea to finding somebody? You know, it's that gap of, okay, like I've got this idea, what's that first step, and how do we get this going? Do you just start with the conversation with people, the scientists you know, that might be able to put you into the right direction, or is there a hub for this somewhere, or is that you?
Yeah, there are actually organizations that connect researchers with newsrooms. I am blanking on some of the names. I wasn't ready for that question, but it's a very good one. And so that is something that you can kind of go and put your name in the hat and say, hey, I'm really looking for this kind of researcher. But fundamentally, I mean, for journalists, you know, don't be shy, like pick up the phone, like go do your Googling, go do your research, like find out who's published. I think part of the criteria for identifying a good partnership is from the journalism side, like identifying a researcher who is well published and accredited in the space, you know, that you're trying to address, right? You don't want to get, you know, a foot-size researcher to do your microplastics research, right? So like pick the right person who's got that, and that they have a real track record of publishing, and then what they've published on professionally, but also, you know, it's smart to look at their social, you know, footprint, basically, like how do they talk about the issue online? Would that negatively impact the validity of the research in any way if you work with that scientist? And also, how comfortable are they speaking publicly? Again, in our case, Dr. Mason was a super easy and comfortable public speaker. She'd done a lot of it, and that was a good thing because, man, all the newsrooms we worked with wanted to re-interview her. And, you know, once the story broke, then we helped her manage requests for interviews and appearances because it really, you know, wasn't something she was going to be able to handle. As far as finding that person, I mean, you can find universities. I mean, you guys are all at universities. You can look at the researchers in your university and find out who's doing that kind of work and ask them to refer you if they're not. For people who are interested in doing more data-oriented projects, that's also, you know, if you're in a university, you have a head start on almost everybody else. You know, so just, you know, I think the headline, Lisa, would be like, my mother called me stubborn. I say I'm relentless, you know,
Right.
like you just
So
kind of like, you have to care.
Yeah, speaking of relentless, like how long do you have to stick with this in terms of how long it was from idea to generating the partnership to getting this going, and how much time does this take? You know, a lot of our community here are early career professionals or journalists or, you know, students, you know, starting in their careers, you know, and do you have, I guess, a sense of how much time this type of thing will take?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say not everything that takes long is good, but a lot of great things in journalism often take a little longer. So these two particular projects, the tap water one took longer largely because we broke it into chunks and we were waiting for funding and our funder was not fast. But also I think just to flag, like, research academics doesn't move at a pace newsrooms would like or are accustomed to, and you just have to build in time. I think Dr. Mason, once she had the samples for the tap water project, I think it was like 3 months, 2.5 months, maybe like a semester before we had her raw results. And then, with the bottled water, it was actually longer because we were testing more things and her lab was busier with other projects, right? So we were really like slotting into work she was already doing. So it can take months. If you're working with a physical scientist, you as the journalist don't necessarily need to sit there at the lab every day. So you can work on other things. And the data science projects can be faster, but that's also can be slow because there's a lot of work to do in that. So I think you pick something you care a lot about because you will spend a lot of time on it.
I don't want to dominate the questions. We have about a couple more minutes left. I'm hoping that we'll hear some more questions from the attendees here as we finish out this. So please put your questions into the chat and I will break it up. But I think that I'm looking here. I think we had a question about I think it was uncertainty. We may have been able to. I think you were able to answer that. How you made it, I guess, a piece of your reporting that was very solid and it dealt with the uncertainty component, and it was something that you had the newsrooms add to each of the stories, and that was non-negotiable, right? Okay, and what about issues around some of the creating partnerships? If you were a data scientist or a scientist who wanted to partner with a journalist, does it come from that direction as well? And are you the hub for that, or who does help make that connection to journalists?
Yeah, so if you are a researcher sitting on a really cool scoop, like, share it. Definitely it can go the other way. In our case, it didn't, but it certainly could. And I think my thoughts for, data scientists or researchers running labs that want to work with newsrooms, I think if you've already designed your study, right, and you're kind of ready to come out, I think you need to think about the audience that study impacts and reach out to a media brand that serves that audience. And then, whatever your choices are, maybe there's only one or maybe there's 20, think about the reputations and look at how they handle science. How do they report science? Do you like it? Like, do you think they handle it responsibly? If not, you're probably going to have a pretty gritty and unpleasant experience, right? So finding a brand that you think does a really good job handling the science is important. And then if you haven't designed your study yet, but you really want to sort of go full in, I think, call an executive editor and basically say, hey, I'm at USC and I'm doing this research and I think it's important because, and, I'm just getting the research started and I saw this organization that collaborated with scientists, and I wanted to see whether you guys were interested in doing a longer term collaboration around a project like this. Does that help, Lisa?
Yes, great. I think that the final question I have, and I maybe just in one or two sentences you can sum it up. I guess in developing these collaborative partnerships, what are the three things we need to remember about doing this work from both sides? What are the three most important pieces to remember?
Okay, so I'll try. So one, it is a dance, and who's leading the dance changes back and forth, right? So there's times when the editor or the reporting team is going to be leading, and there's time when the scientist is going to be leading, and you need to allow for that. Your scientist isn't your, you're not their boss, right? This is a partnership. I think the second is just, radical transparency, not with every comma that's out of place, but, really being, having integrity and honesty in the way you're sharing and the problems you're encountering, because both sides of that relationship can better manage them when they hear them early, right? And the third, I think, is integrity, and holding each other to account for, the relationship and how, the agreements you made and what you understand. And openness to, I guess, like comment or criticism, right? I mean, and how something is framed is like, don't feel like you have everything perfectly. Like, work with someone else because it will make your work better. And I think that really is, so work with people you respect and respect them, just in short.
Great. Those are three great components. Anything else to add from your end, Victoria?
No, actually, Molly nailed it. I would just say that I think great things come from that yes and attitude applied to journalism and science, which is a really rare thing because both industries are built to be skeptical. But in this relationship, coming at a collaboration with curiosity and enthusiasm, I think is what creates a result that really steps above and beyond what either party could do by themselves.
So we've got curiosity surrounding a dance where we have a partnership. We have sort of this radical transparency, so we know what each other are doing, and we have an integrity in the approach that we're working on. So that creates good teamwork. Well done, and thank you so much for bringing all of this to our attention, for leading such an interesting conversation today. We'll be sharing this out, and we'll be able to potentially include some of these resources in our note to everybody following up with this. Thank you so much for being here. This has just been so informative to everybody, and look forward to seeing what partnerships might come from this. So it's really great for us.
Yeah, great. Let me know, please. If you start something, I'd love to hear about it.
Right.
Thanks,
Thank
Lisa.
you all.
Thanks, everybody.